Hollywood never knew what to do with Barbara Marr, except look at her. From the moment she arrived, the city reacted the way it always did when confronted with something too striking to be understood. It stared, it whispered, and then it tried to own her. Beauty, in that place, was not a gift. It was a claim. She entered the industry in the early 1920 seconds, when motion pictures were still learning how to lie convincingly. Studios sold dreams in black and white, and the public was eager to believe that glamour was harmless. Barbara Marr shattered that illusion simply by existing. Her face carried a dangerous clarity, a kind of beauty that did not soften under the lights. It confronted, it lingered, it demanded. The press called her the girl who is too beautiful. It was meant as praise. It sounded like a prophecy. Born Reatha Dale Watson, she arrived in Hollywood with a past that refused to stay buried. She had been married young. She had written. She had danced. She had survived in places that did not reward innocence. By the time she stood before a camera, she understood desire and consequence in equal measure. That knowledge made her magnetic. It also made her expendable. In 1921, Fox Film Corporation signed her to a contract that looked generous on paper and predatory in practice. Like many agreements of the era, it offered opportunity without protection, exposure without stability. The studio controlled her image, her schedule, and quietly her narrative. In return, she was expected to deliver performances that confirmed what audiences wanted to believe about her. Barbara Marr did not fit easily into that arrangement. She played women marked by longing and ruin, characters who seemed to know how their stories would end. Audiences mistook this for acting. It was closer to recognition. Hollywood encouraged excess in private and punished it in public. Marr was given access to the city's darker pleasures, and then blamed for knowing how to use them. Parties blurred into obligations. Relationships became transactions. Every choice she made was recorded somewhere, even when it was never written down. By 1923, gossip columns had begun to circle. Her name appeared alongside words like reckless and unreliable. None of it was precise enough to challenge. That was the point. Vagueness is a powerful weapon. It allows judgment without accountability. Behind the scenes, her health began to falter. Tuberculosis shadowed her life, an illness that thrived on exhaustion and neglect. The studio did not slow her schedule. Productions continued. Appearances were demanded. The machinery did not pause for weakness, especially when weakness could be reframed as moral failure. Barbara Marr's beauty became the justification for everything that happened to her. When she struggled, it was because she had been indulged. When she suffered, it was because she had lived too fast. Hollywood turned consequence into character flaw, absolving itself with elegance. The public narrative was already forming. She was wild. She was fragile. She was doomed by her own appetites. These explanations were comforting. They suggested that tragedy was personal, not structural, that the system remained intact. What was left unsaid was how thoroughly she had been consumed. In 1925, her roles diminished even as her notoriety grew. The imbalance was telling. Fame no longer translated into opportunity. It became a spectacle detached from support. When she appeared in films, critics spoke more about her appearance than her work, as if beauty alone were the point. Her contract tightened. Her autonomy vanished. Decisions were made for her, then attributed to her. The studio watched as her health declined and calculated what could still be extracted. Compassion did not factor into the equation. Hollywood has always been skilled at separating image from responsibility. Barbara Marr's final years unfolded under this separation. She was photographed constantly, even as her body weakened. She was celebrated as an icon while being quietly abandoned as a person. When she could no longer maintain the pace demanded of her, the industry adjusted its language. She became a cautionary tale. In January 1926, she died at the age of 29. The cause was listed plainly: tuberculosis. The story that followed was anything but. Headlines framed her death as inevitable, the natural end of a life lived too intensely. Hollywood mourned publicly and learned nothing. What it refused to examine was how beauty had been turned into obligation, how fame had functioned as a trap disguised as privilege. Barbara Marr did not fall from grace. She was pushed forward relentlessly until there was nowhere left to stand. The tragedy of her life was not excess. It was exposure without refuge. And the curse that followed her was not mystery or scandal, but something far more ordinary and far more enduring. A system that mistakes consumption for admiration and destruction for destiny. By the time the lights dimmed, Hollywood had already decided what her story would mean. The question it never allowed was whether it could have meant something else. By the time Barbara Marr understood what Hollywood expected of her, the expectation had already hardened into policy. Beauty was no longer an attribute she possessed. It was a resource the industry believed it owned. Every glance, every movement, every rumor attached to her face was treated as yield. The studio system of the early 1922s thrived on this kind of ownership. Contracts were not designed to protect talent. They were designed to secure output. When Fox formalized its arrangement with Marr, the language emphasized availability, obedience, and image control. What it did not include were provisions for health, rest, or discretion. Those were considered personal matters, profitable only when they failed. Her workdays stretched into nights. Sets ran hot under arc lights that scorched skin already taxed by illness. Tuberculosis was still spoken of in euphemisms, an affliction best managed through denial and pace. Slowing down invited replacement. Marr knew this. She showed up when she should not have, smiled when breathing hurt, and learned how to hide fatigue behind angles and shadows. Hollywood rewarded endurance with attention and punished vulnerability with suspicion. The press, fed selectively by studio publicists, constructed a version of Marr that emphasized appetite over effort. She was photographed at parties she could not refuse, then criticized for attending them. Her presence was required to maintain the illusion of excess. Her exhaustion was used to confirm it. This contradiction was not accidental. It was efficient. In 1922, as her screen reputation grew, so did the scrutiny around her private life. Affairs were suggested without being substantiated. Associations were exaggerated. None of it needed to be proven. The implication was enough. Studios rarely corrected these narratives. They served a purpose. A star framed as volatile was easier to discipline, easier to replace when the time came. Marr's beauty became evidence against her. It explained every accusation, justified every withdrawal of support. When she fell ill, it was attributed to indulgence. When she resisted certain demands, it was framed as instability. Hollywood had learned how to convert systemic pressure into personal failing. Her roles began to mirror this transformation. She was cast as women undone by desire, figures marked by tragedy and excess. Audiences applauded the realism without recognizing its source. The line between performance and condition blurred until even the studio could pretend it did not exist. Behind the scenes, the calculus was brutal. As long as Marr remained marketable, her health was a secondary concern. When production schedules tightened, she was expected to adjust. When her body faltered, it was treated as an inconvenience rather than a warning. In 1923, reports of her illness circulated quietly. They did not slow her assignments. Instead, they altered how she was discussed. Less as an investment, more as a liability. Hollywood does not discard immediately. It reduces. It waits for the decline to appear self-directed. Marr felt this shift acutely. Calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. Scripts arrived later, then not at all. When she did appear, it was often in roles that carried less prestige, less protection. Her visibility increased, even as her standing diminished. The industry framed this as consequence. She had lived too brightly. She had failed to manage herself. These explanations absolved the system of responsibility and reassured audiences that tragedy followed transgression. What was not acknowledged was how carefully the conditions for that tragedy had been constructed. Beauty in Hollywood was never neutral. It attracted attention that demanded repayment. For Marr, repayment meant compliance, availability, silence. Each refusal carried cost. Each concession carried another obligation. There was no equilibrium, only escalation. The more she gave, the more was expected. The more she struggled, the less sympathy she received. Compassion, like rest, was considered a personal luxury. Studios did not budget for it. As the mid-1920 seconds approached, Marr's situation became increasingly precarious. Her body weakened under the strain. Her reputation hardened under repetition. The narrative was set. She was brilliant but doomed, too beautiful for her own good. Hollywood prefers stories that resolve themselves. By the time her decline became impossible to ignore, the machinery had already prepared its explanation. She was responsible. The system was blameless. Beauty had claimed another victim. What remained unspoken was how thoroughly that beauty had been conscripted. How little room she had been given to exist outside the image imposed upon her. How survival itself had become a breach of expectation. Barbara Marr did not fail Hollywood. Hollywood exhausted her and called it fate. And as the contracts tightened and the lights burned hotter, the curse attached to her name took on a shape that could no longer be denied. One written not in scandal or excess, but in the quiet, methodical erosion of a life treated as spectacle, until there was nothing left to sustain it. The industry would later mourn her loss with poetic language. It would never acknowledge how precisely it had arranged it. By the time Hollywood decided what Barbara Marr represented, the decision had very little to do with who she actually was. The industry had found a story that worked, one that explained her volatility, justified her suffering, and absolved everyone else. It was a familiar narrative, sharpened by repetition. A woman undone by her own excess. The illusion was convincing because it borrowed fragments of truth and rearranged them for convenience. Marr did attend parties. She moved through Hollywood's social circuits with ease. Her presence requested, expected, sometimes demanded. But these gatherings were not indulgences in the way the public imagined. They were extensions of work, unspoken obligations tied to visibility and favor. Absence was noticed. Decline was interpreted. To refuse was to risk being forgotten. Hollywood did not teach women how to say no. It taught them how to disappear when they tried. The press seized on the image eagerly. Columns described her as reckless, fragile, unpredictable. Words that suggested moral failure without ever specifying acts. This ambiguity protected everyone involved. Studios could deny responsibility. Writers could claim they were only reflecting public interest. Readers could consume tragedy without discomfort. What went largely unexamined was how little control Marr had over the circumstances feeding these stories. Her schedule was relentless, her health precarious. Tuberculosis, untreated and aggravated by exhaustion, drained her quietly. In that condition, even survival could be misread as excess. The industry preferred that misreading. In 1924, as the moral climate in Hollywood tightened under external scrutiny, studios became increasingly anxious about appearances. Scandals involving male stars were reframed as unfortunate exceptions. Scandals involving women became cautionary tales. Marr, already vulnerable, fit the template perfectly. Her beauty amplified the narrative. It made her suffering legible as punishment. Too beautiful, the story went, to be disciplined, too desirable to be restrained. Beauty became motive, explanation, and verdict all at once. Behind the scenes, Marr's reality was far less theatrical. Medical advice urged rest, isolation, treatment. None of these were compatible with her obligations. Production schedules did not bend. Publicity demands did not soften. Illness was accommodated only insofar as it could be concealed. When she missed work, it was noted. When she complied despite illness, it was expected. The margin for error narrowed until it disappeared entirely. The illusion of excess served a crucial function. It shifted focus away from labor conditions, contractual coercion, and institutional neglect. It transformed structural exploitation into personal flaw. Audiences were invited to judge rather than question. Marr understood this shift. She watched as her image was repurposed, her decline narrativized in advance. The more she struggled, the more the story hardened. There was no version of events in which she could emerge blameless. Hollywood's treatment of her was not unique. It was exemplary. As her reputation darkened, opportunities evaporated. Roles that required trust were withheld. Projects that might have stabilized her career went elsewhere. The industry did not need to fire her. It simply stopped investing. Public sympathy was managed carefully, enough to frame her as tragic, not enough to inspire accountability. The difference mattered. In private moments, Marr attempted to recalibrate. She spoke of slowing down, of leaving Hollywood temporarily, of focusing on recovery. These plans rarely materialized. Each delay carried professional cost. Each absence invited replacement. The system thrived on this dilemma. Survival required participation. Participation ensured deterioration. By late 1925, her physical condition had worsened significantly. Weight loss, fatigue, persistent illness. These signs were interpreted publicly as evidence of the very excess they resulted from. The logic was circular and unbreakable. Hollywood does not question stories that sustain it. Marr's beauty, once her entry point, had become her sentence. It justified intrusion, exploitation, and eventual abandonment. When she faltered, the industry expressed regret without responsibility. It lamented the loss of potential rather than examining how thoroughly that potential had been consumed. The illusion of excess allowed everyone to look away. What remains most unsettling is how ordinary the process was. No single villain, no singular betrayal, just a system responding predictably to vulnerability, preserving itself through narrative control. Barbara Marr did not live fast because she wanted to. She lived fast because slowing down meant erasure. Hollywood ensured that either outcome led to the same conclusion. The tragedy, then, was not her supposed recklessness. It was the careful construction of a story that made recklessness appear inevitable. And once that story was accepted, her fate no longer required intervention. It only required repetition. The illusion did the rest. By the mid-1920s, Barbara Marr's body was no longer keeping pace with the story Hollywood demanded she perform. Tuberculosis, long treated as an embarrassment rather than an emergency, had tightened its grip. It was the kind of illness that required quiet, distance, and time. Three things the industry had never learned to offer women who were still useful. Hollywood did not deny that she was sick. It simply refused to let sickness interrupt productivity. Studios had become adept at reclassifying physical decline as behavioral failure. Fatigue became unreliability. Pain became temperament. Absence became evidence. When Marr struggled to appear as required, the explanation circulated before she could offer one of her own. She was difficult, she was unstable, she was slipping. These words carried no diagnosis, only judgment. Medical advice urged rest, but rest had no contractual value. Her agreements contained no obligation to protect her health, only to exploit what remained of it. If she slowed down, she risked being replaced. If she continued, she risked collapse. Hollywood presented this dilemma as choice, knowing full well it was not. In 1924, production schedules tightened across the industry as studios attempted to consolidate profits and manage growing public scrutiny. Efficiency became a virtue. Compassion did not. Marr's condition made her inefficient, and inefficiency in Hollywood was treated as defiance. She continued working through periods of acute weakness, often arriving on set already depleted. The lights were unforgiving, the hours long. Illness was invisible until it could no longer be ignored, and by then it was already being reframed as liability. What made this period especially cruel was the way sympathy was rationed. Marr was still photographed, still discussed, still admired in abstract terms, but the support that might have preserved her time away, reduced demands, genuine care, never arrived. Concern existed only as image management. Hollywood had learned how to mourn without preventing loss. As her health declined, the tone surrounding her shifted again. The tragic star, the doomed beauty, the inevitable fall. These phrases appeared with increasing frequency, preparing audiences for an ending that no one intended to avert. Tragedy, once anticipated, no longer demanded intervention. Behind closed doors, decisions were made quickly and without ceremony. Roles were reassigned, projects reconsidered, insurance concerns cited quietly. Marr was no longer discussed as an asset to be developed, but as a risk to be managed. She felt this withdrawal immediately. The phone rang less often, meetings evaporated, promises were deferred indefinitely. There was no confrontation, no dismissal, just a gradual absence of opportunity that felt deliberate in its restraint. Hollywood's cruelty was never loud. The press continued to circulate stories that blurred illness with indulgence. Weight loss became proof of excess. Weakness became spectacle. The truth that her body was failing under relentless pressure was less compelling than the myth that she had brought this upon herself. Illness, in this narrative, was not something that happened to her. It was something she was. Marr attempted to reclaim control in small ways. She spoke of stepping back, of leaving the city temporarily, of prioritizing recovery. Each plan required cooperation from an industry already preparing for her disappearance. Cooperation was not forthcoming. The system did not need her to die. It only needed her to stop demanding accommodation. By late 1925, her appearances were infrequent and strained. When she did surface, it was often in public settings where her fragility could be observed and interpreted. The camera did not soften. It documented decline with the same enthusiasm it had once documented allure. Hollywood, watching from a safe distance, adjusted its language again. She was no longer reckless. She was tragic. The shift allowed for pity without responsibility. It framed her suffering as poetic rather than preventable. What went unspoken was how much of her illness had been exacerbated by neglect. How rest might have altered the outcome. How care might have interrupted the trajectory already being written for her. But such questions threatened the system's self-image. It was easier to accept tragedy than to confront complicity. Barbara Marr's body became a boundary Hollywood refused to acknowledge. When it could no longer sustain the demands placed upon it, the industry did not adapt. It recalibrated its expectations downward and prepared to move on. Illness had rendered her inconvenient. And in Hollywood, inconvenience is not treated as a call for care, it is treated as notice. The lights dimmed slightly around her, not enough to draw attention, just enough to signal that her place was no longer secure. What remained was a woman still alive, still struggling, already being spoken of in the past tense. The ending had not yet arrived, but Hollywood was already rehearsing how it would explain it. By the time Barbara Marr reached the final months of her life, Hollywood had already decided how it would remember her. The narrative was waiting, polished and patient, ready to be deployed the moment it was needed. Tragedy, in this city, is most useful when it arrives on schedule. In early 1926, Marr's health had deteriorated beyond concealment. Tuberculosis, untreated long enough to become irreversible, confined her increasingly to private rooms and guarded appearances. Friends noticed the change immediately. Her voice thinned, her movement slowed. The energy that once filled rooms receded into something fragile and watchful. Hollywood responded with a peculiar calm. Studios did not scramble to help her recover. They did not halt productions to accommodate her absence. Instead, they adjusted their expectations quietly, as if her disappearance were already a fact. Contracts expired without renewal. Discussions that might have offered support never began. The machinery had shifted its focus elsewhere. The press followed suit. Coverage softened, then narrowed. Articles spoke of her in the past tense while she was still alive. She was framed as a figure already lost. Her decline presented as foregone conclusion rather than unfolding crisis. Sympathy was extended carefully, measured to evoke emotion without prompting inquiry. What made this moment especially revealing was how little resistance the narrative encountered. The public accepted the framing readily. It aligned with what they had been taught to believe, that Marr had lived too intensely, that her beauty had been a curse, that her fate was sealed by her own excesses. Hollywood encouraged this interpretation because it required nothing further. Marr herself was aware of the story being written around her. Confined physically, she retained clarity about how the industry operated. She understood that her death would not disrupt Hollywood's rhythm. It would complete a cycle. A star would be mourned, lessons would be implied, responsibility would dissolve into sentiment. Those close to her recalled moments of lucidity mixed with exhaustion. She spoke occasionally of unfinished plans, of recovery imagined too late. There were hints of anger, but little bitterness. Bitterness would have required the belief that someone might still listen. Her illness removed her from the public sphere at precisely the moment when intervention might have mattered most. Without visibility, there was no urgency. Without urgency, there was no action. The system did not need to conspire. It only needed to continue as it always had. On the 30th of January 1926, Barbara Marr died at the age of 29. The response was immediate and carefully choreographed. Headlines appeared within hours. Obituaries emphasized her beauty, her promise, her tragedy. Tuberculosis was cited as the cause. Lifestyle was implied as context. The framing was complete. Hollywood mourned efficiently. Statements from studios expressed sorrow without introspection. Colleagues spoke of her talent and charm. There were no acknowledgments of neglect, no questions about workload, no recognition of the conditions that had accelerated her decline. The tragedy was individualized, isolated, rendered safe. Her funeral drew attention, but not accountability. Photographs captured grief without analysis. The spectacle reinforced the narrative rather than challenging it. She had been too beautiful, too intense, too fragile for the world she inhabited. This explanation satisfied everyone except the truth. What was never said publicly was how predictable her death had become within the industry. How discussions about her future had ceased well before she stopped breathing. How silence had replaced concern months earlier. Hollywood did not kill Barbara Marr. That distinction mattered deeply to those who wished to maintain moral distance. But it had created the conditions under which her death was not only possible, but convenient. After her passing, her films were briefly revisited, then quietly shelved. Her image lingered just long enough to be absorbed into legend. The cautionary tale was complete. The industry moved on. What remained unresolved was not the cause of death, but the preparation for it. The way her decline had been anticipated, narrated, and accepted long before it concluded. The way intervention had been rendered unnecessary by expectation. Barbara Marr's death did not shock Hollywood. It confirmed what it had already decided, and in that confirmation lay the most unsettling truth of all, that her tragedy was not an interruption of the system, but one of its most refined expressions. The story had been written in advance. All that remained was to close the curtain and call it destiny. After Barbara Marr's death, Hollywood moved swiftly to fill the space she left behind, not with silence, but with meaning. The woman was gone. The image remained, and the image, once detached from the living body that had complicated it, became far easier to manage. Almost immediately, Marr was transformed into a symbol. The girl who was too beautiful became shorthand for a specific kind of tragedy, one that felt inevitable and strangely comforting. Beauty, the story went, carries a cost. Excess leads to ruin. Some stars are born doomed. These conclusions required no structural critique. They preserve the system by turning failure inward. Hollywood prefers legends to people because legends do not demand care. Studios, press agents, and columnists refined the narrative with practiced efficiency. They selected details that reinforced inevitability and discarded those that suggested neglect. Tuberculosis was mentioned, but rarely examined. Exhaustion was implied, but never contextualized. The machinery that had demanded constant visibility, constant performance, constant sacrifice, vanished from the story altogether. What remained was a morality play. Marr was remembered not as a working actress, subjected to relentless pressure, but as a fragile beauty consumed by her own intensity. Her illness was folded neatly into that image, stripped of its environmental causes. The industry did not need to deny facts. It only needed to arrange them in a way that obscured responsibility. In the years that followed, references to Marr grew increasingly stylized. Writers invoked her name to warn other actresses, to illustrate the dangers of indulgence, to romanticize suffering. Her story became a lesson, but never a question. No one asked why she had been allowed to work while gravely ill. No one asked why rest had been treated as disobedience. No one asked why support had vanished long before her life did. These omissions were not oversights. They were necessary. Hollywood's mythology depends on the idea that outcomes are personal. If Marr's death could be traced back to institutional practices, then the system itself would appear fallible, even cruel. It was far safer to present her as uniquely vulnerable, a woman too delicate for the world she chose. This framing was reinforced visually. Her photographs circulated endlessly, often divorced from chronology. Youth and vitality were emphasized. Decline was aestheticized. The images suggested a life lived brightly and briefly, without hinting at the exhaustion that preceded the end. Her films, when mentioned, were praised for mood rather than labor. Performances were discussed as if they had emerged effortlessly, unconnected to the physical toll exacted by production schedules and illness. Work was rendered invisible. Suffering was rendered poetic. Hollywood had perfected this transformation long before Marr. She was not the first, nor would she be the last. But her case was especially useful because it appeared to confirm the industry's favorite myth, that beauty itself is dangerous. That myth served multiple purposes. It distracted from exploitation. It justified control. It warned others without implicating anyone in particular. It suggested that the system merely reflected human nature, rather than shaping it. For women still working in the industry, Marr's legend functioned as both caution and threat. Be careful, be grateful, be manageable, or you too may become a story instead of a career. The irony was that Marr herself had not lived recklessly in the way the legend implied. She had worked relentlessly. She had endured conditions that would have broken many. Her so-called excesses were largely responses to pressure, attempts to survive in an environment that offered no refuge. But nuance does not travel well through time. Legends do. As decades passed, Barbara Marr's name surfaced occasionally in retrospectives and trivia, almost always accompanied by the same phrases: too beautiful, too wild, too much. Each repetition reinforced the erasure of context. What was lost in this repetition was the understanding that her tragedy was not accidental. It was engineered through neglect, enabled by silence, and preserved through storytelling. Hollywood had replaced the woman with a version of her that could be admired without discomfort, a legend that absorbed blame and deflected inquiry, a cautionary tale that asked nothing of the listener except sympathy. This replacement was the final stage of consumption. Barbara Marr had given her body, her health, her labor to an industry that framed her destruction as destiny. After her death, it claimed her story as well, shaping it to fit a narrative that required no accountability. The system survived intact. The lesson was absorbed. The warning remained. And somewhere beneath the legend, beneath the photographs, the headlines, the romanticized decline, the woman herself disappeared entirely. Not forgotten, replaced. The question that lingered was not whether Barbara Marr had been cursed by beauty. It was whether Hollywood had ever allowed her to be anything else. In the decades after Barbara Marr's death, Hollywood continued to repeat her story as if repetition might turn it into truth. Each retelling stripped away another layer of context, until what remained felt almost mythic. A beautiful woman arrives. She burns too brightly. She vanishes young. The pattern was familiar enough to feel natural, even necessary. Calling it a curse made the ending easier to accept. A curse suggests inevitability. It implies forces beyond control, beyond responsibility. In Barbara Marr's case, the language of curse functioned as a final act of absolution. If her fate was preordained by beauty itself, then no one had to ask who benefited from that belief. Hollywood embraced the phrase quietly. It fit too well. By the mid-20th century, Marr existed primarily as a reference point. Her name appeared in books about early Hollywood excess, in essays about doomed stars, in lists of tragedies that seemed to confirm the industry's darker mystique. Rarely did these accounts linger on contracts, schedules, or medical neglect. Those details complicated the spell. Instead, her story was framed as a warning about desire, hers and the audience's. She became an example of what happens when a woman cannot outrun her own allure. The implication was clear. The danger lived inside her, not around her. What this framing concealed was how methodical her destruction had been. There was nothing supernatural about the pressure she endured. It was contractual, economic, cultural. The curse was not beauty itself, but the way Hollywood treated beauty as obligation rather than a tribute. Marr was expected to perform glamour indefinitely, regardless of cost. When her body failed, the system did not adjust. It explained her failure as personal destiny. This explanation proved durable because it was useful. It allowed Hollywood to mourn its casualties without changing its practices. It preserved the illusion that tragedy happened to stars, not because of the industry, but because of who they were. Barbara Marr became a ghost that served the system. Her absence was instructive. It taught others what could happen if they faltered. It reinforced the belief that survival required silence, compliance, endurance. Her fate hovered over Hollywood like folklore, invoked whenever a woman appeared too visible, too fragile, too defiant. And yet, when examined closely, the curse dissolves. What remains is a record of choices made by institutions, not by fate. Decisions to prioritize output over health, to value image over care, to frame illness as weakness and exhaustion as failure. These were not accidents. They were policies enforced informally, preserved through silence. The tragedy of Barbara Marr was not that she could not escape fame. It was that fame had been constructed as a trap disguised as recognition. Once inside it, every attempt to slow down, to recover, to reclaim agency was interpreted as breach. Hollywood did not allow her to leave gracefully. It only allowed her to disappear. The persistence of the curse narrative reveals more about the industry than about Marr herself. It exposes Hollywood's discomfort with accountability, its preference for metaphor over mechanism. Curses are poetic, systems are not. To acknowledge that Marr was destroyed by ordinary practices would require confronting how many others were shaped, damaged, or erased by the same forces. It would mean admitting that glamour has always depended on disposability. So the story remained enchanted. Today, when her name resurfaces, it often does so without resolution. A beautiful photograph, a tragic anecdote, a reminder of how fragile stars once were. The conversation rarely extends beyond that. The curse remains intact because it continues to protect the mythology that surrounds it. But myths weaken under scrutiny. When Barbara Marr's life is traced carefully, the pattern that emerges is not mystical. It is procedural. A woman enters a system without safeguards. Her value is extracted rapidly. Her health declines. Support is withdrawn. A narrative is prepared in advance. Her death confirms what the story has already decided. Nothing about this requires fate. The true tragedy is not that Barbara Marr was too beautiful. It is that Hollywood refused to imagine her as anything other than consumable. When consumption ended, so did concern. Her disappearance was not an isolated incident. It was an early example of a logic that would repeat itself, refined and rebranded across generations. Different faces, similar endings, always framed as inevitability. The curse, then, was never supernatural. It was institutional, and institutions survive by ensuring that their casualties are remembered as stories, not as evidence. Barbara Marr's legacy deserves more than poetic sorrow. It deserves clarity, an understanding that what happened to her was not mysterious, not accidental, and not unavoidable. It was the predictable result of a system that mistook beauty for ownership and endurance for obligation. The lights that consumed her have long been replaced by newer ones. The machinery has grown more sophisticated. The language has softened, but the pattern remains recognizable to anyone willing to look past the myth. Barbara Marr was not cursed. She was used. And the most enduring tragedy is not that she vanished young, but that Hollywood taught itself nothing from the way it happened.